So let's talk about new industries. And I should say existing industries, new growth, new changes. New industries is just easier to put into a single headline here. So, um, as I mentioned before, we are the facilitators of the Berkshire Blueprint 2.0. So we really have focused on five primary economic clusters. So these clusters are going to be what I touch on first, and then we'll talk about the sixth really truly emergent thing that's occurred very significantly over the course of the pandemic. So with advanced manufacturing, which is a massive opportunity and a massive economic cluster, bringing in huge revenue to the Berkshires, equating to around $1 billion a year into our regional economy. Here are some of the things that really hit them or impacted them potentially positively over the pandemic. So supply chain interruptions, and you'll see this as a theme across most of these. Huge supply chain interruptions has actually led to a lot of interesting developments in terms of things that folks might have needed to source from overseas. They're really looking to now onshore the supply chain so that they can have easier access to things, especially when supply chains become very shaky. In a global market during a pandemic, shakiness would definitely be the word. And so supply chain interruption has been huge and has impacted their ability to meet demands of their own products in some cases. So an increased demand for specialized products, in particular PPE, right? So when we talk about the protective elements that folks needed, the sterilization products that folks needed, Berkshire Sterile, had the contract for doing work around the vaccines. We had Boyd Technologies doing work around PPE development. And we've got a number of stakeholders and businesses and opportunities. Zogix, for instance, producing air purification systems. And all of this stuff is really bubbling up because of the pandemic. So there's this increased demand for specialized items, which many of these things are likely to have a fairly long runway in terms of when they will be needed and when there will be a demand for them. Medical and PPE blah, 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 blah. A medical and PPE device demand. Talk about a mouthful. So both increase in new, like I was just talking about. And then a new ecosystem and networking needs and growth. And this is where we've seen things like the Berkshire Innovation Center really becoming a center point to providing the opportunity for both small and large advanced manufacturers or those who are starting off in an advanced manufacturing setting coming together and really building new connective tissue that ultimately is going to result in big opportunities going forward. We've seen some really big, exciting announcements, especially around aerospace here in Pittsfield through the Berkshire Innovation Center. But also seeing that, also having these veins that run kind of throughout the entirety of the Berkshire economy when it comes to advanced manufacturing. So that ecosystem development is something that we all want to keep an eye on, because if you are someone that has a business that has a peripheral or a direct impact in advanced manufacturing, you're going to want to insert into those networks early and often. When it comes to food and agriculture, the virtual farmers market, this is a huge model shift here in the Berkshires. So much so of our farmers markets have been in person or at a farm stand, CSA models, things along those lines, which all did very well, did well in certain ways too. But the virtual farmers market model was a significant shift. Staffing shortages. We talked about it, again, staffing shortages exist across all of these clusters, but with this one, especially when you talk about seasonal staff, right? Those who are actually, picking the goods for you to eat, making sure that we're getting those folks in and, because they're traveling all over to do that actual agricultural work, that critical work that feeds the country and feeds our county. And so those staffing shortages can actually impact their ability to meet the demand for their goods. The low and no contact demand. So when you think about some of these online farmers markets, these are situations where they may have delivered the bag to your front doorstep. That never was happening really in the Berkshires prior to the pandemic. So that is a huge change, and it really increases the staffing overhead or the volunteer overhead in order to make these things operational. Supply chain impacts, again, ranges everywhere from the fertilizers that you need in order to do the work to getting the paper products in to do your delivery service from your restaurant, to PPE, all of those things. There were certain supply chain things, toilet paper early on, right? That was a big issue. And those staffing shortages, I should also mention, exist still in many of our food businesses, having enough staff, especially going into our busy season here in the Berkshires. Closures, both temporary and permanent. You know, it's really sad when you see businesses, and really unfortunate when we see businesses close um, temporarily, but especially when it's permanent. And you know, there's so many layers to what causes those things, and what could be done and can be done. And so a lot of that then goes to those resources that we'll talk about later, and how those can help to make businesses more resilient and more resistant to the need for closure. But that's certainly been something that has ebbed and flowed. And now that we're seeing this reopening phase, we're really seeing a lot of positive momentum there. However, gaps have been created by those closures. And that's not to say that these gaps are all good. These gaps can sometimes prevent people from getting access to the food and the nutrition that they need access to. But in other ways, it's actually caused some innovation around how do you serve more folks in more rural areas in a more robust fashion. And so I think that those gaps are creating some innovation and creating some opportunity and some, you know, entrepreneurial exercises that have been played out over the course of the year in order to fill those gaps, and creating new food ventures in general, new farming ventures in general. And then innovative experience creations, right? So talking about how can you create a unique experience around your food, around your restaurant, if you're doing takeout or if you're doing deliveries more, how do you still maintain that thing that makes you special if you're not getting the ambiance of your space? Healthcare, telehealth, biggest thing on the list, right? You know, moving to telehealth here has had immense impacts, both positive and some challenging. But it's definitely been a massive shift, and one that I think is probably going to persist for a foreseeable. You know, a huge decrease in missed appointments because now you're able to actually meet the person no matter where they are and when they are. But challenge is getting technology to people. You know, while our students and our education systems were, there was definitely a huge push to get the technology in their hands. There's still an entire generations of Berkshire residents who may not have had as readily available access to technology early on, and that shift has taken some time to catch up to. Seeing patients where they're at. This is an interesting one because when you see a patient in their home, you learn a lot more about them than when they are just in your office, right? There's a little bit more of the unspoken that can actually be indicated, where you may be able to diagnose things a little bit more clearly when you can see the environment that they're in, when you might be able to identify environmental factors, things along those lines. And then the increase in wellness apps and changes in behaviors. We've seen some interesting behaviors of people just being outside and walking more. There's a lot of research being done right now that indicates that just walking and being active is something that is hopefully going to be a sustained impact of the pandemic. People just getting outside and being more movement based. But we've seen more use of wellness apps and more opportunities to develop those wellness apps, or those apps that actually move people around in a community. CauseQuest is a recent development here in the Berkshires that has been one that gets people out. It moves them around. Even when they weren't able to necessarily go into businesses, it was still moving them around businesses in the scavenger hunt mentality. And those are opportunities to actually create some wellness along with some continuity of commerce. Hospitality and tourism, major blow to this cluster, as everyone would expect. You know, we saw major closures, long-term closures, and you know, now seeing the rebound and the opportunity for that to come back. But pivoting, like these are folks that are constantly pivoting anyway in their industry, and it got even more significant during the actual pandemic itself. So really changing how they're working with their guests, how they are able to keep their revenue on target, and how they're having to match grants and loans and all these programs in order to keep the lights on, and to make sure that they're still here when the next phase of the economy comes together. And that includes the new models of operations. You know, in some cases, you know, just operating on weekends or just operating a couple days a week so that they could ensure cleaning operations were done and that all the rooms were sterile and those things. Virtual experiences, when we talk about tourism especially, you know, we saw museums that created entire online databases of their exhibits and opportunities along those lines. Those are things that could still be maintained and used as actually a marketing hook to get people to come. New approaches to cultivating patrons. So, you know, actually the outreach piece has, sorry, I keep hitting the wrong button here. But new ways of reaching out and cultivating the generation of patrons who are both going to be, you know, customers now, but may actually be supporters in the long term. And how do you reach a more diverse demographic of folks? Because that is the way the world is moving. We are becoming more diverse, and that is important for our hospitality and cultural and tourism industry to really engage it. New training programs for a new era. Berkshire Community College just launched one recently that was very exciting in this realm, and those are going to continue to be coming up as we see the need and the demand to get the workforce ready for the jobs that exist. And massive investments. And I just put 50 million plus because that's like kind of a conservative number. But we've seen an immense number of properties be purchased for renovation and renovations begun on during the pandemic. And that is a sign of what is to come in terms of not just attracting the new markets here, but actually retaining them because you're providing the high quality services and the new experiences that they expect. The creative economy, a lot of similarities here that you'll see, but immense growth in startups. We've seen a lot of solopreneurs take off and really run with their product and their opportunity. New methods of showcasing their work, so using online systems especially, or doing mail order kits. Common Folk Artist Collective in North County, they pulled together boxes that people could order, and it was like a creative experience in a box, which was an interesting way of doing online sales during a time when they couldn't have in-person retail. In general, though, massive losses year over year. We did a little bit of a survey back in the fall, and we identified that there was around 66% of those who responded saw at least some loss over the course year over year. That's that was a while ago now, so there's some updating that could probably occur there, but those losses are certainly very tangible to folks, especially when creative economy is their livelihood. So a lot of them ended up finding second jobs and seeking those out, and ending up in some cases going full-time into a job that they may not have even looked at before the pandemic, but that was how they needed to make ends meet. And then significant demand for their product is an interesting one. We've seen a lot of folks investing in the arts, purchasing art for their own home uses and purchasing creatively made items, or really looking at the written word and blogs and things along those lines, which fall into the creative economy. Podcasts have become massive and continue to see a growth trajectory. So there's this really interesting demand that occurred for a cross section of the goods and services in the creative economy. Now let's talk about the new cluster that we are really looking at and very excited about. The outdoor recreation economy is on a massive upward trajectory here in the region. So just to give you a taste, just in 2020, 2021, at least $30 million in investment is either happening or slated for investment / announced in recent history. And this includes public and private dollars. And this number, again, is likely very conservative in terms of what's going to be invested in the next year or so. This means that there's those dollars being invested are looking at this as an opportunity to get a return. They're not just dollars to be spent for dollars' sake. These are investors who see the opportunity and the writing on the wall and want to jump on board and get their goods, their opportunities up there so that the next iteration of visitors to the Berkshires and the economy of the Berkshires can really take advantage of it. Insane use and participation in 2020. If you went hiking or you went biking or you went kayaking or whatever, you saw a lot more people out probably than you would have seen otherwise. And these are not just locals using these resources, it's visitors and those who have become new residents. And so that insane use has really driven a lot of the want and need to retain that customer base. And so you're going to see that continue on, especially going into summer 2021. There's definitely a number of gaps, though, that could be business opportunities. Berkshire Regional Planning Commission and Milltown Capital did a really incredible study right before the pandemic came into play. So timing is kind of everything with this. But that study identified where there were certainly some opportunities for potential new businesses to jump into the pool and make a go at it and really drive economic impact going forward. And so I highly suggest checking out that study. And new habits aligning with the enhanced offering. So this whole idea that people are out there walking and biking and everything, you couldn't find a bike in the Berkshires for a while here. And so we're seeing now that, okay, how does that then look in this next phase? We're talking, e-bikes and things like that, new bikeability studies that are occurring north to south and everywhere in between, new rail trail extensions. So those habits are matching those offerings and will continue to hopefully do so, especially as this idea of just getting outside and being healthy and well is continuing to be a vein of importance. So opportunities, here's just a handful. Peripheral supports are really the things that I think are going to have a lot of opportunities. So small businesses that develop around providing those peripheral supports, but also businesses that are already directly in this outdoor recreation piece, especially. There's immense growth opportunity. The density of industry stakeholders is creating a lot of new networking opportunities. We host our entrepreneurial meetups every month at One Berkshire. We just started in person again with this last one, and we're going to continue going forward in person. And there's a great appetite and a great want and need for you to network with others that are experiencing similar things and potentially have opportunities for collaboration. Collaborative marketing opportunities being one of those. So those opportunities have always existed in some way, shape, or form. We do a lot of those through our marketing team, but they're becoming even more important because if a few people put a few dollars in, it's going to have a much bigger impact than one person putting a few dollars in. So you can really kind of build a critical mass of capital to drive marketing and draw attention to your goods and services. And then the critical mass effect. This is one of those things where, for example, I owned a cafe at one point. It was a crepe shop in North Adams. And I said from the get-go, it would have been great if another crepe shop opened across the street. And why would that be a good thing? Well, the good thing is that creates a critical mass of visitors looking for crepes. And so they may try both of us. They might just try one of us. But what it does is it starts to create sort of a flow of people. And so when you're seeing more entrance of businesses in our different clusters, they're adding to that critical mass. They're going to continue to drive the attention. They're going to continue to drive more people to be paying attention to those industries and those clusters. And so it's, again, rising tides raise all ships. And so it's good to have neighbors that have some similarities to you, because ultimately then people are going to seek out those locations because that's where they want to be. And those are the things that they're looking for.